Hello and thank you for joining me on this part of the photography badge. In this part we will be looking at the skills and the knowledge and the techniques required to understand how to take better photographs and for making videos. So you'll need to learn and show that you understand some of the main camera settings or filming techniques, as well as looking after the equipment, about editing, and then we'll move on to some of the different tasks that will be involved in working on the badge as well. So in regards to photography, we'll be going through some of the knowledge and how to use the camera in regards to exposure. So we'll be looking at shutter speed, aperture, ISO, and using a flash. And when it comes to video, we'll be looking at panning, tilting, zooming, and using close-ups. You can also use more lights for video as well, so we'll do a little bit of coverage on that. If you have a digital camera or DSLR at home, or have used one before, that's fantastic. We'll also be using a couple of apps on the smartphone too, so that those of you that don't have those facilities at home can do this in your own time with your own devices. If you do plan to use a smartphone or a tablet to complete and work on this, then please download the Lightroom app from the App Store. It's a little bit better than the inbuilt photo app on an iPhone and on an Android device, and it will allow you to adjust a few of the different settings that we're going to be talking about. When it comes onto the video side of things, we'll also be using the iMovie app for the editing. So please go ahead and download that now too. So first things first, we're going to be looking at exposure. Exposure is how bright or dark the photo is. So just like the shot that you're looking at now, I've exposed this shot so that I am fully lit, and you can see a bit of the background as well. If a photo is too dark, this is called underexposed. And if a photo is too bright, it's overexposed. We're now going to talk about some of the different settings that you can use inside a camera to make sure that your exposure is set correctly. You can use the shutter speed, aperture, and ISO settings to control the exposure. And just like portrait mode on a smartphone, you can use the aperture to blur the background out. This is called depth of field. The aperture on a camera with a lens will be displayed like this, f/3.5 for example. On a smartphone, you don't get control of the aperture, so this won't be one of the features that you can use with the Lightroom app. If you were taking portrait photos of a person or a subject like me, or a still life like an object or a flower for example, and you want to blur the background, you'll need to look at using a wide aperture. So this is an aperture that has a number like f/3.5. You'll also notice when you change the aperture on a digital camera that the lower the number is, the brighter the image is. If you were taking a landscape photo where you want lots of detail to be in focus, then you need to use a narrower aperture or a deeper depth of field. This results in more object in the foreground and background being in focus. You'll notice if I stick my hand up now, the camera should focus on my hand. My face is now out of focus. And now if I remove my hand, the camera will lock focus back onto me. This is because I'm using a shallow depth of field. So if you're back to taking a landscape photo, if you were going to take one of, say, Polesden Lacey, or you're out and about on a walk, you should consider using a deeper depth of field with an aperture of something like f/11. As I mentioned earlier, this can be set on a digital camera, but not on a phone. Another setting that we're going to be talking about is shutter speed. This affects the blur in your photo, so you can freeze motion by using a very fast shutter speed, or you can slow down the motion and make images blurry, so capturing light trails or time lapses, and this is a slow shutter speed. Your shutter speed on a camera will be displayed like this, 1-120 for example. The higher the number on the shutter speed, the faster the shutter, So if you're using a shutter speed of say 1-2000, then you're going to be outside in bright sunlight capturing fast motion. However, if you're in the dark, you'll be looking at using a shutter speed that is much slower, so maybe 1-10. The difference with this is that the higher the number, the darker the image is, and the lower the number, the brighter the image is. ISO is another additional setting that you can use to affect the exposure of an image. This is digital brightness that the camera can add in for you. However, you must be aware that at higher ISO numbers, you will start to see noise and grain in the image, and the photo on the video will become a little bit blurry and lose detail. So if you're adding ISO into your photo, then you should look at a balance of this. Try and keep your ISO as low as possible. It's time to look at this on a camera and then on a phone. One thing to note is that each camera will have a slightly different way of changing these settings. We are now going to look at changing the shutter speed, the aperture and the ISO on a digital camera. As I mentioned before, each digital camera will have a slightly different way of changing these settings, slightly different dials, but the overall techniques will remain the same. The first setting that we're going to be looking at is the shutter speed, which is displayed down here. You can see at the moment my shutter speed is displayed at 1/60 or 1-60. When I change my shutter speed using this dial, you can see that as the numbers increase, the image gets darker. You might find that when you're outside in bright sunlight, you'll need to use a faster shutter speed like 1/800. If I now dial back, you can see that the image gets brighter. This will be very good if you are shooting photos in dark environments, but you will need to remember that the slower the shutter speed, or the lower the number, the more blur there'll be in the image. The next setting that we're going to be looking at is the aperture, which, as well as controlling the level of brightness in the image, also controls the depth of field. And this is the difference in the blur that you can see between this character that I have here and the little clock in the background. If I tap on the screen, you can see that this little character of Mr. Bean is out of focus, but the clock is in focus. This level of blur is called a shallow depth of field, and is good for taking photos such as portraits or still lifes. However, if I wanted to get both Mr. Bean and the clock in focus, then I need to adjust my aperture accordingly. So, you can see the aperture displayed here as f4. I'm now going to reduce my aperture, and as you see me doing that, the image gets darker. But you'll also notice the clock in the background begins to come into focus. The image at the moment is very dark, so I now need to compensate by adjusting my shutter speed. You can now see that there is less blur between the object and Mr. Bean. Lastly, there is one other way of adjusting the exposure in the image, and that's the ISO, which is the digital brightness the camera can add in. I can adjust this by selecting this setting here, and you can see I have a number of different options increasing and decreasing. So, as I increase my ISO from ISO 250 upwards, you can see that the image is getting brighter. If I increase this to a very, very high level, the image starts to get overexposed. However, if I now adjust my shutter speed, bring my shutter speed down, you'll start to notice when looking at the finer details of the image that there is noise and there is inherent loss of detail in the image. So you should avoid shooting your photos and your video at a very, very high ISO like this. This is ISO 16000. If you can, you should try using your ISO at the lowest possible setting, depending on where you are. We are now going to look at photography using the Lightroom app on a smartphone, so make sure that you have downloaded Lightroom first. When it's downloaded, tap on Lightroom and open it up. There is a blue icon with a camera on the bottom of the app. Tap on that to open it up. That's my cat Alfie, and he's going to be our subject for the photography. You can see on the bottom of the app there's different numbers and different settings. The first one that we're going to look at is sec, which will adjust the shutter speed. You can adjust this by sliding left and right, and as you can see on the top of the app, the shutter speed will be displayed there. You'll notice that the lower the number, the brighter the image gets. We can now adjust the ISO, and you'll also see that the lower the ISO number, the darker it is, and the higher the ISO, the brighter it is. What you need to remember with the ISO is that the higher the number is, the noisier the image will be, and the less detail there will be. You can see that by looking at the background. We're now going to adjust the shutter speed to compose our image properly. To do this, I'm going to set my ISO to the lowest possible setting, and then adjust my shutter speed so that the exposure is right. I don't want the image to be too bright. You can see that a shutter speed of 1/40th and an ISO of 40 is good for this. And this is the resulting photo. In slightly darker environments, you may look at using a flash to increase the exposure of your photo. You don't really get flash for video, so you will have to look at using additional lights, such as lamps or torches. This can help you expose your scene and expose your photo. Now that we have covered those kind of main parts of exposure, this is a short task for you. Take a number of photos, whether that is on a digital camera or on your phone using the Lightroom app, that shows an image that is underexposed, correctly exposed and overexposed. Try and correct the exposure by using the shutter speed and the ISO if you're using a phone, or if you're using a digital camera, use the shutter speed, the ISO and the aperture together. What we'd also like to see is how you control the aperture. So we'd like to see a photo that you have taken of a portrait or a still life. This can be of a friend, a family member, a pet or an object. But what we would like to see is your control over the aperture. To control the aperture on a smartphone, you can tap on the subject. You'll usually get a frame guide around them which shows that object is in focus. You'll then see the background being out of focus. These items can be sent to us and emailed to us using the email address that will appear now on the screen. For the video part of the badge, we're going to be using a smartphone or a tablet device. It could be an iPhone or it could be an Android phone, but we're going to be using the normal camera app rather than a different camera app that has some more advanced settings in it. There are a few things to bear in mind when you're going to start filming and making videos on this phone, and that is that we want to make sure that we keep the phone in landscape mode. This is the kind of standard format for any kind of videos and filming, so just bear this in mind as a good starting point for you to use. You can also change the recording settings of your camera by going into the camera's settings, and you can choose HD, 4K, whatever the resolution that you have available to you in your camera phone. To start with, you're going to open your camera app and you're going to switch it onto video mode. Your next step will be to tap on your subject or the person that you're filming or the object that you're filming. What this does is this will put your object in focus. You'll often get the option to increase or decrease the brightness. On an iPhone, a small sun icon appears, and you can drag this up to make the image brighter, or you can drag it down to make it darker. As well as understanding exposure, there are some additional video techniques that are important when building a story and putting a video together. There are lots of different video techniques, and we will be looking at panning, tilting, zooming and close-ups in this part. If you are going to pan, you are going to move the camera to the left and to the right in a left and right motion. This is very good for following your subject or to introduce your subject into the frame. Tilting is when you move the camera up and down on an axis. So you can use this to show an element of scale, or again you can use it to introduce a scene by tilting up from a ceiling or a sky down to your subject and your scene. Zooming gets you closer or further away from your subject or your scene. When you zoom on a digital camera, you are using a lens to zoom, and this is called an optical zoom. If you are using a smartphone, this uses what is called a digital zoom. There is a slight difference between these two, and that usually if you are digitally zooming, you are losing some of the quality, whereas on an optical zoom, you are retaining the quality of the image. Lastly, a close-up shot. Close-up shots can be used for dramatic effect, to exaggerate emotion, or they can be used for showing detail. Whether you are using a smartphone or a digital camera, you should consider ways to keep it steady. If you have a smartphone, then you can use a small tripod device or something like a selfie stick. If you are using a digital camera, you might have a tripod at home. This will help keep the camera steady. To help you plan the shots that you're going to get for a video, you can produce something called a storyboard. It looks something like this. So what I've done here is I've divided a piece of paper into 6 different sections just by folding it. What I've then done is just use a pencil to draw the shot ideas that I have. And this goes through those different shots that I just talked about. So we have an introduction shot, we have a tilt to introduce our character and our subject, we have a close-up shot, we have a pan from left to right, we have a zoom in, and then we go back to our original framing. As you can see from my drawing, I am no artist. So you can use stick figures or text or arrows to describe the motion that you might see on the camera and to just give you a better idea when it comes to planning your shots. So your task, if you're following the video part of this badge, is to choose a subject or a story. It can be a simple one, such as cooking a meal, or about a pet or a member of your family. You can then put together a very simple storyboard like that one I just showed you that lays out your story. It can be on a piece of paper, or you can do it on a computer if you like. It should denote the different skills and techniques that we've talked about. For example, using a pan, a tilt, a zoom, and a close-up to communicate your story. The next part of this badge is going to be looking at how you can care for your equipment. If you're using a smartphone, you may be familiar about using a case or maybe wiping the lens to get a clearer image. But if you're using a digital camera, you may be thinking about other ways to protect it. We'll now discuss a few different accessories that you can use when you're out taking photos or when you're filming. So have a think about those now.